It was a damp, foggy August morning in 1975 when a father and son set out early for a simple fishing trip on Sherman Lake in Newcastle, Maine. The serenity of the water was shattered by a gruesome discovery. At about 8 o'clock, as they prepared to cast their lines, the two fishermen noticed something floating near a bridge. Upon further investigation, they discovered the body of a young woman. The horrified pair ran to a nearby farmhouse to call the police, initially reporting what they assumed was a drowning. But as officers arrived, it became clear this was no accident, but rather the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Maine for decades. A Lincoln County deputy sheriff was first on the scene on that August 16, 1975 morning. He noticed potential signs of foul play and secured the area, then called in the Maine State Police from Augusta. By the time state detectives arrived, a small crowd of onlookers had gathered in shock along the road. The victim's body was found face down by the water's edge, arms outstretched and hair fanned across the shallow lake. She was mostly clothed, and she still wore some jewelry, including a silver bracelet and a small pendant. However, despite these identifying features, no ID was found with her, so her name remained a mystery at the time. As officers pulled the body from the water, the cause of death became grimly apparent. A dark ligature mark encircled her neck, and bruises were visible all over her body. The state medical examiner determined she had been in the water less than 24 hours, suggesting the slaying likely occurred the night before. The perp had made little effort to conceal the crime scene, and the young woman had simply been dumped in the lake. In the days after the discovery, the victim still had no name. Investigators canvassed the area, interviewing locals and checking with hotels, campsites, and police agencies for any missing person matching her description. Some even theorized she might have been a seasonal waitress or other summer worker passing through. Despite these efforts, no one could identify the young woman. Growing desperate, authorities took a very rare step. They released a post-mortem photograph of her face to the media and asked them to broadcast it on the local news and put it in papers. Remarkably, this gamble paid off very quickly. This photograph was published in a Boston newspaper and caught the attention of a family in Massachusetts who immediately recognized the woman. 10 days after the body was found, the young woman was finally identified as 19-year-old Florence Lowes of Brockton, Massachusetts. Investigators confirmed the identification through photographs, dental records, and jewelry she had been wearing. Florence's family hadn't even realized she was missing at the time. Her mother had spoken with her only about a week before the tragedy, so no missing person report had ever been filed. Florence was recently divorced from her marriage to Richard Paul Lowes and had moved back to Brockton, where she was living with a roommate. She had worked as a nurse's aide, but by that summer she was between jobs. Importantly, Florence had strong ties to Maine, and her father lived in the area near where her body was found. Investigators learned that on August 15, 1975, Florence left Brockton intending to travel north to visit him. With no car, she likely hitchhiked the roughly 150-mile journey. Sherman Lake lies just off U.S. Route 1, a major coastal highway, so the hitchhiking theory neatly explained how a Massachusetts traveler could end up there. Tragically, Florence never made it to her father's house. At some point on her journey, she crossed paths with the perpetrator. Once Florence's identity was known, law enforcement in both Maine and Massachusetts retraced her steps and searched for suspects. Maine State Police detectives teamed up with Brockton Police and Massachusetts State Police, following leads in both states. Investigators interviewed people in Brockton who had seen Florence before she left, hoping to learn if she mentioned any travel plans or companions. They looked at everyone in her life, including her estranged husband, for anyone with a possible motive. Initial news reports even indicated that detectives had a few promising leads in Massachusetts. Despite this early momentum, no perpetrator was ever identified. By September 1975, officials acknowledged that the investigation had stalled with no new developments. By 1977, 2 years after the crime, police admitted they were still no closer to an explanation than on the day Florence's body was found. Over the years, several theories have surfaced about what happened to Florence Lowes. The most widely held belief is that she fell prey to a dangerous stranger while hitchhiking. Accepting a ride from the wrong person carried obvious risks, and many suspect that Florence was picked up by someone who then turned violent. Her state of undress suggested a possible indecent assault, though the autopsy couldn't prove it one way or the other. Perhaps a passing motorist or truck driver offered her a ride, then assaulted her before dumping her body. If Florence was slain by a random predator, possibly even a serial offender, solving the case would be incredibly difficult. Further, there's no indication that there was any biological evidence of any kind from the offender left at the scene. Given that this was well before the era of the forensic usage of DNA, it's possible that such evidence simply wasn't even collected. While the very obvious and blatant forms of biological evidence did tend to be collected at this time, less obvious forms often didn't. For instance, if there were skin cells from the perpetrator under Florence's nails, this likely would have gone unnoticed at the time. Another theory is that the attacker wasn't an out-of-towner at all, but someone who knew the local area, or even knew Florence personally. Locals noted that a stranger unfamiliar with Newcastle might not easily find the desolate location where she was dumped, especially in the dark. This fuels suspicion that whoever left her body there knew the area well. Indeed, rumors in Newcastle have long speculated that a local person was responsible. Perhaps Florence accepted a ride from someone she thought she could trust, maybe even an acquaintance, who then betrayed her in the worst way. Investigators have never publicly identified a suspect, and no evidence has confirmed this local perpetrator theory. Still, the idea lingers, leaving many to wonder if the perp was closer to home than anyone realized. Decades later, Florence's slaying remains unsolved, with seemingly little to go on. The case remains open, and Maine's Cold Case Unit continues to review it periodically in hopes of a breakthrough. Unfortunately, we're now 50 years out from this horrific tragedy, and as time ticks by, it becomes less and less likely that the perpetrator will ever face justice. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with the usual reminder to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Also, I've just launched the Lazy Chill History video podcast, where I'm slowly rolling out all my content from my history channel. I've included the link in the description, so make sure to like and follow over there as well. On a cold Friday night in February 2000, 20-year-old Angus Shanahan, who went by Gussie, walked out of a Limerick pub and vanished into the darkness without a trace. He left behind a half-finished bottle of beer on a doorstep and stepped into a narrow laneway, appearing to vanish into thin air. What began as an ordinary evening out quickly transformed into one of Ireland's most baffling missing person cases. It would take 18 years for any trace of Gussie to surface, and even then, the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. This is the story of Gussie Shanahan's disappearance, a night out gone terribly wrong, and the theories that still swirl around a case that remains unsolved. February 11th, 2000 began like any other day for Gussie Shanahan. He finished his shift at the Dell computer plant in Castletroy that afternoon and headed into Limerick City to kick off the weekend. Gussie stopped by the bank where his father worked to repay a small loan and mentioned his plans for the night ahead. He then grabbed a quick bite to eat and met up with two close friends to begin the evening. Also, as a quick aside, Limerick had an incredibly seedy reputation at this time and was known for a significant amount of knifing incidents. My understanding is the reputation of the city hasn't improved much, and it's basically the Glasgow of Ireland, but I digress. The trio headed to Cooper's Bar on St. Joseph Street, a pub near his friend's apartment. They had a couple of drinks, and Gussie was in high spirits, chatting with other patrons. By around 9:30, both of his friends had gone back to their apartment, leaving Gussie at the bar on his own. He lingered a while longer and even tried calling a few other friends to join him, but no one was available at that hour. Sometime close to 10:30, Gussie left the pub alone, and security cameras captured him crossing the street toward his friend's building after leaving the pub. A neighbor sitting in a parked car saw Gussie walk up to the apartment door, raise his hand as if to knock, then hesitate and turn away. He set down the beer bottle he was carrying, put on his jacket, and headed off toward a dimly lit alley. Nobody ever saw him come out the other side of that alley, and that was the last confirmed sighting of him. When the Shanahans hadn't heard from Gussie by the end of that weekend, they grew alarmed. By Monday morning, February 14th, Bob Shanahan checked his son's bank records and saw no activity since Friday. When Gussie also failed to show up for work that day, the family filed a missing person report and alerted the cops, and a full-scale search operation was soon launched in Limerick. Police, family, and volunteers scoured the city and surrounding areas for any sign of the missing young man. They retraced Gussie's last known route through the downtown streets and even searched the River Shannon, fearing he might have ended up in the water. Despite exhaustive efforts, no clues turned up. There were no signs of a struggle in the alley where he was last seen, and none of Gussie's belongings were ever found. For the Shanahan family, the pain of not knowing was immense. Gussie's mother, Nancy, was so heartbroken by her son's disappearance that she suffered a stroke, and she died in 2016 without ever knowing her son's fate. Despite this, Bob and Gussie's siblings vowed to continue the search for Nancy as much as for Gussie. They kept his story in the public eye through media appeals and persisted in contacting anyone who might help. But now, let's step back in time to 2001, because it turns out a John Doe case hadn't been properly connected to Gussie's disappearance. On October 28, 2001, about 20 months after Gussie disappeared, a search team discovered partial skeletal remains on Key Island in the Shannon Estuary. A few bone fragments were recovered, but at the time they couldn't be identified. Early DNA tests failed to link the remains to any known missing person, so the fragments were stored as unidentified and largely forgotten. For 17 years, those bones sat in storage while the Shanahans continued to agonize over Gussie's fate. Finally, in late 2018, advancements in DNA technology provided an answer. A re-examination of the Key Island bones matched them to Gussie Shanahan, and in October 2018, the family received official confirmation. In November 2018, the Shanahans were at last able to hold a funeral for Gussie. They laid his remains to rest beside his late mother Nancy, as the family had always hoped to do. This partial closure also prompted law enforcement to take a fresh look at the case. The authorities opened a complete review of the investigation's original files and appealed again for information, treating the case with renewed urgency. After 18 years of painful uncertainty, there was finally a concrete development, but the question of how Gussie ended up in the river remained unanswered. With confirmation of Gussie's death, the focus turned to how it happened. One theory is that his death was a tragic accident. Perhaps Gussie, while walking alone, wandered toward the river and fell in by mistake. However, his family and others doubt this. He was last seen walking away from the water and didn't appear to be overly intoxicated, which makes an abrupt accidental drowning seem unlikely. Moreover, intensive searches along the Shannon at the time found no trace of him, casting doubt on the idea that he simply slipped into the river that night. Likewise, his family noted that Gussie had no personal problems that might have prompted him to do something to himself. The leading theory, which Gussie's family strongly believes, is that he met with foul play. Early on, suspicions arose that he may have crossed paths with dangerous individuals after leaving the pub. Information later emerged, suggesting Gussie might have ended up at a house party or gathering, in the company of people with violent reputations. The family believes something went terribly wrong, perhaps an argument or assault, and that Gussie was slain, and his body dumped into the river when the heat cooled down. Over the years, the Shanahans have received tips supporting this theory. In one instance, an anonymous caller told Bob Shanahan that Gussie, quote, ended up in the water that night because he was put there, implying others were responsible. Over the years, there has even been speculation about a broader pattern. Coincidentally, 2 other young men employed at Dell in Limerick vanished in the years around Gussie's disappearance, though there's been no official connection between the cases. To date, no one has been charged in connection with Gussie Shanahan's disappearance, though his family and the authorities continue to cling to the hope that this Irish cold case will be closed. In 1970, a Harvard scientist believed he had witnessed a superhuman feat of memory. A student known as Elizabeth stared at a random pattern of 10,000 dots with one eye, and the next day looked at a second pattern of 10,000 dots with her other eye. Incredibly, her mind fused the 2 images into a single picture, as if she had taken a mental photograph of the first pattern and stored it overnight. This startling result offered a tantalizing glimpse of the concept known as photographic memory. Yet Elizabeth never underwent further tests, and somewhat bizarrely, she married the researcher and slipped out of the spotlight. This left behind a burning question: was her ability real, or just an illusion? Eidetic memory is the ability to vividly recall an image for a brief time after seeing it, almost as if the image were still present. A very small percentage of young children show this ability, describing pictures in detail from memory for a few minutes before it fades. In adults, however, true eidetic imagery is virtually non-existent. One theory suggests that as we develop language and abstract thinking, we lose the raw visual snapshot ability we had as children. However, the popular notion of photographic memory goes beyond eidetic images. It implies permanent and exact recall of visual information, but experts say there's no proof that anyone actually possesses such unlimited visual memory. Scientists have long been skeptical that photographic memory exists. Aside from the Elizabeth story, no scientific study has ever verified a person with long-term photographic recall. Her case was never independently replicated, and after the 1970 publication, Elizabeth refused further testing and married the researcher, which feels like some sort of ethical breach. This very unusual relationship between the researcher and the subject strongly suggested to some scientists that the original researcher was trying to rizz up Lizzie by making her feel unique. Nevertheless, legends of photographic recall persist. For instance, it's said that mathematician John von Neumann could recite entire books from memory, and similar claims have been made about other prodigies. These anecdotes are hard to verify, and even if true, they likely reflect exceptional learning techniques or intense focus, rather than a literal camera-like memory. For instance, individuals are able to memorize and recite very lengthy religious texts from memory without error due to intensive focus, devotion, and repetition. Overall, research shows that human memory doesn't work like a recording device. It's an active, reconstructive process where we assemble pieces of information rather than play back an exact copy. In experiments, even people with excellent memories can't recall a complex image with perfect fidelity once it's out of sight. That said, these people can recognize images they saw before among thousands of new ones with around 80% accuracy. But recognition is much easier than free recall. In fact, scientists believe our brains would likely need a completely different architecture to store exact snapshots of every scene. Some individuals do have astonishing memory abilities, just not the unlimited photographic kind. A handful of people have highly superior autobiographical memory, meaning they can recall almost every day of their lives in vivid detail. A famous case is Jill Price, who can tell you what she was doing on a given date years ago, even describing minor events and the day's weather. Yet even she doesn't have a crystal clear snapshot of every scene, and her gift is limited to personal memories. And she still forgets plenty of information outside her own life story. And I use the term gift here in quite a loose sense, since the idea of being able to remember every moment of your life basically sounds like hell. There are also memory champions who perform jaw-dropping feats like memorizing dozens of decks of cards in minutes. However, they achieve this through practice and clever strategies, not an inherent photographic memory. These mental athletes train to encode information using vivid imagery and patterns, rather than instantly absorbing scenes at a glance. In rare cases of savant syndrome, some people exhibit extraordinary memory in specific areas. For instance, British artist Stephen Wiltshire can draw entire city skylines from memory after a short helicopter ride. These abilities are incredible, but even savants are not photographic in the broad sense. Stephen Wiltshire's memories, for instance, are highly specialized. Despite the lack of hard evidence, the idea of photographic memory refuses to die. It remains a staple of fictional geniuses, something that's attributed to real geniuses, and a topic of fascination for the public. In the end, photographic memories likely don't exist, and the idea as scientific reality likely stems from a very unusual relationship between a researcher and his subject. Imagine you're a traveler in southeastern Kansas in the early 1870s. The country still has the fresh scars of conflict and the promise of a new life, of 160 acres to call your own, has pulled you west. The landscape around you is an immense, unforgiving prairie. It's a lonely expanse where homesteads are scattered like islands in a sea of grass, and your nearest neighbor might be miles away. This is Labette County, a place carved out of land recently ceded by the Osage Nation, a place defined by both boundless opportunity and profound isolation. Your journey follows the Great Osage Trail, a path worn into the earth first by migrating buffalo, then by Native American tribes, and now by the wagons of settlers like yourself. It's a vital artery of westward expansion, but it's also a place of great danger. The weather is harsh and unpredictable, with tornadoes, blizzards, and floods that can erase a homesteader's dreams overnight. Violence is a constant threat, whether from conflicts with displaced tribes or from the battle-hardened American men who now work their way onto the frontier. In this vast emptiness, people simply vanish, and when they disappear, the prairie keeps their secrets. As dusk begins to settle, casting long shadows across the plains, you spot a light. It comes from a small one-room cabin, a welcome sign of life in the desolate landscape. A crude, hand-lettered sign above the door reads, "Groceries." This is the Bender Place, a wayside inn offering the promise of a hot meal, supplies, and most importantly, a safe place to rest for the night. For a weary traveler, it seems like a sanctuary, a fragile outpost of civilization where the unspoken code of frontier hospitality offers a moment of peace. You approach, unaware that the trust you're about to place in these strangers is the last mistake you'll ever make. This humble cabin wasn't a refuge, it was a slaughterhouse, and for at least a dozen travelers, this beacon of hope on this great migratory trail was the end of the line. This is the disturbing story of the Benders, a supposed family of innkeepers who committed horrific actions before performing one of American history's greatest vanishing acts. To understand the horror that unfolded in Labette County, one must first try to understand the perpetrators. But the Bender family itself is an enigma, a collection of four individuals whose true identities, origins, and relationships remain a mystery. They presented themselves as a simple homesteading family, but they were a carefully constructed criminal conspiracy, a human machine where each member played a specific and deadly role. The patriarch, John Bender Sr., was a man of about 60, described by those who met him as a repulsive and brutish figure. He was a giant of a man, with piercing eyes and a sullen, ill-tempered demeanor. Like the other members of this so-called family, he claimed to be from Germany. As with all the members of the family, it remains unclear what their true origins were, as German was commonly spoken across Central and Eastern Europe. And to get in my one mandatory Simpsons reference per video, no one who speaks German could be an evil man, right? His wife, Elvira Bender, was around 55 and equally disliked by her neighbors, who called her a she-devil. Unfriendly and sinister, she was rumored to have slain previous husbands before arriving in Kansas, and she dabbled in folk magic, claiming to be a medium who could cast spells. While she claimed not to understand English, a moment of rage during a confrontation later revealed her command of the language was far better than she let on. The younger generation presented a stark contrast. John Bender Jr., about 25, was handsome and spoke English well, though with a German accent. He had a peculiar habit of laughing without cause, which led many in the community to suspect there was something wrong with him. This perception, whether genuine or an act, made him seem harmless and non-threatening, a perfect disguise for the violence he was capable of. The public face and undisputed star of the operation was Kate Bender. Around 23 years old, she was universally described as beautiful, intelligent, and intensely charismatic. She was fluent in English and was the only member of the family who actively engaged with the surrounding community. Kate was the family's lure, and her chosen bait was spiritualism. In an era when communicating with the dead was a popular and widespread belief, Kate advertised herself as a powerful psychic, healer, and spiritualist medium. She distributed flyers and gave lectures, claiming she could cure blindness and deafness with the laying on of hands, contact the spirits of the deceased, and locate lost possessions. Her lectures also promoted radical ideas like free love, which, while scandalous, only added to her notoriety and drew curious visitors to the family inn. And by curious travelers, I mean men traveling alone who definitely thought they had a chance with this frontier cutie. Kate's persona was the perfect tool for disarming travelers, and she was basically the honeypot that lured victims in. With her charm and supposed supernatural gifts, she could win their trust. This would draw them into intimate conversations where they would reveal their travel plans and, most importantly, their financial situations. The very foundation of this group was built on lies. While they were widely believed to be German immigrants, no official documentation of their origins, or even their real names, has ever been discovered. The name Bender itself, while a fairly common German name, was almost certainly an alias. Even their family ties were likely a complete fabrication. Neighbors reported that the intimacy between John Jr. and Kate seemed more like that of a husband and wife than siblings. The reason for doing this was also a part of their ruse. In a society built on the family unit, the image of a family-run inn offered a veneer of safety and respectability that was crucial to their predatory success. The Benders' genius for evil was not just in their deception, but in their engineering. They transformed their humble, one-room cabin into a highly efficient machine capable of quote-unquote processing guests. The cabin was a simple wooden structure measuring about 16 by 24 feet. Inside, they had made a simple but critical modification. A large, heavy canvas wagon cover was hung from a rope, splitting the single room in two. The front area was the public face of their operation, a small general store and a dining room where travelers could get a meal. The area behind the curtain was the family's private quarters, but its true purpose was to serve as a blind from which to launch their ambush. Their modus operandi was a chillingly refined process. After Kate identified a suitable victim, usually a man traveling alone with significant money, he would be invited to dinner and given the seat of honor at the table. This seat wasn't a gesture of hospitality, it was a tactical position. It placed the guest with his back directly against the canvas partition, perfectly silhouetting his head for the attacker waiting behind it. As the unsuspecting traveler ate his meal, captivated by Kate's charm and conversation, one of the male Benders would slip behind the curtain. At the right moment, the attacker would swing a heavy hammer, striking the victim on the back of the head with crushing force. Beneath the victim's chair, or immediately beside it, was a concealed trapdoor. The stunned or dead man was immediately dropped through the opening into a dark, stone-lined cellar that was 6 feet deep. This allowed for the instant removal of the body from the main room, minimizing mess and the risk of discovery should another guest arrive. The body was then stripped of every valuable before being disposed of. Under the cover of night, the bodies were removed from this subterranean abattoir and buried in the family's 2-acre vegetable garden and apple orchard just north of the cabin. In a particularly macabre detail passed down through local lore, it was said that Elvira Bender used the apples from the trees growing over her victims' graves to bake pies for future travelers. The Benders' reign of terror lasted for nearly 2 years, from May 1871 to the spring of 1873. During that time, they eliminated at least a dozen people, though the true number may be much higher. Their victims were the forgotten travelers of the frontier, men whose disappearances created distant ripples of concern, but no organized alarm until it was far too late. After all, Kate was an expert at finding men who were very far from home, and whose disappearances wouldn't be noticed for months or even years. The case that finally brought an end to the Benders' slaughter began with the disappearance of George Newton Longcore and his 18-month-old daughter Mary Ann in the winter of 1872. A recent widower, Longcore was traveling back to Iowa and was carrying a significant sum of money. When they vanished, Longcore's former neighbor from Independence, a physician named Dr. William York, became concerned and set out to find them in the spring of 1873. Dr. York's search led him along the Osage Trail and inevitably to the Bender Inn, where he, too, disappeared. The attack on Dr. York was the Benders' final overreach. For 2 years, they had preyed on the anonymous and the transient, individuals whose disappearances could be easily dismissed. Dr. York, however, was a prominent man, and more importantly, his brother was Colonel Alexander York, a Kansas state senator. Unlike the families of other victims, Colonel York had the influence, resources, and unwavering determination to mobilize a search and demand answers. In March 1873, Colonel Alexander York arrived at the Bender's Inn, methodically retracing his brother's last known movements. During his initial questioning, the family deployed their well-practiced deception. They admitted Dr. York had stopped there, but insisted he'd continued on his way. They casually suggested he might have fallen victim to an attack by a local tribe or by highwaymen, common and convenient explanations for such disappearances. Kate, the master manipulator, pretended to be deeply concerned and offered to hold a séance to contact his spirit, telling the colonel to return another day. She let him know that he needed to come back alone, in what was a brazen attempt to make the investigator their next victim. But Colonel York was not easily fooled, and he sensed a profound evil in the small cabin and left, deeply suspicious. His doubts were confirmed when he learned of another traveler, a woman who had recently fled the inn in terror after Elvira threatened her with a knife. York returned, this time with an armed posse of men that definitely weren't clowning around. The confrontation was tense, and Elvira's subsequent explosion of rage shattered her facade as a simple woman who couldn't speak English. This outburst further solidified Colonel York's conviction that the family was hiding a dark secret, but in the end, nothing happened yet. As York's investigation intensified, the wider community, already on edge from the string of disappearances, reached a breaking point. A town meeting was convened where dozens of local men gathered to decide on a course of action. They resolved to obtain a warrant and conduct a search of every single homestead in the township. In an act of astonishing audacity, the Bender men were also present at that meeting. They sat among their neighbors, listening as the community organized the very search that would inevitably unearth the bodies buried in their own garden. It was a final, desperate gamble to appear innocent, an attempt to deflect suspicion that was doomed to fail. The Benders knew the moment the vote was taken that their time was up. They could perhaps deceive a lone questioner, but they couldn't survive a systematic, official search of their property. Sometime in the days following the meeting, under the cover of the vast Kansas night, they packed what they could, abandoned their homestead, and vanished. Their escape was discovered a few days later when a neighbor noticed their farm animals were starving and the inn was eerily silent. Unfortunately, a spell of bad weather delayed a formal investigation, giving the Benders a crucial head start of nearly a month to disappear into the American frontier. When the search party finally forced their way into the abandoned Bender cabin in early May 1873, they were met with a scene of hurried departure and an overpowering stench of death. The source of the odor was quickly traced to a trap door under a bed, which had been nailed shut. After prying it open, they peered down into the stone-lined cellar. The pit was empty of bodies, but the floor was caked with so much clotted blood that it had soaked deep into the earth below, irrefutable proof that this had been a place of slaughter. The search then moved outside to the family's small apple orchard and vegetable garden. The ground in the orchard was soft and appeared to have been recently disturbed. The men began to probe the soil, and it wasn't long before they made their first horrific discovery, the body of Dr. William York, buried in a shallow grave. The news spread, and a full-scale excavation began. Over the next day, the searchers unearthed a graveyard. One by one, they uncovered the remains of at least 10 more people, including George Longcore and his infant daughter. The story of the Benders' House of Horrors became a national sensation. Newspapers from New York to Chicago sent reporters to the remote Kansas prairie, and their lurid accounts of the Devil's Kitchen captivated the public. These accounts took the already horrific realities and added new fictionalized elements in an effort to sell more papers. After fleeing their farm, the Benders' trail quickly went cold. Investigators found their abandoned wagon near the town of Thayer, just 12 miles to the north. But from there, the trail vanished completely. A massive manhunt was launched, and the Kansas governor offered a $2,000 reward, a fortune at the time, for information leading to their capture. What happened to the Benders remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Old West, a narrative vacuum that has been filled with two powerful and competing theories. The first is that they simply got away. In the vast, unmapped expanse of 19th century America, it was entirely possible for four people to change their names, split up, and begin new lives without a trace. This theory is bolstered by the numerous false sightings and wrongful arrests that plagued investigators for decades. In 1880, a couple in Nebraska was arrested and even confessed, but they were soon exposed as imposters. In 1889, two women were arrested in Michigan and extradited to Kansas on suspicion of being Elvira and Kate, only to be exonerated when their alibis proved solid. These incidents reflect a public desperate for closure, but they also highlight how easily the fugitives could have blended back into society, either in America or elsewhere. The second, more pervasive theory is that the Benders met a swift and brutal end at the hands of a vigilante posse. According to this version of events, a group of enraged neighbors caught up with the family shortly after they fled. They dispensed their own form of frontier justice, forcing confessions from the Benders before eliminating them. While no physical evidence supports this story, it aligns with the harsh realities of the frontier, where communities often took the law into their own hands when official channels failed. The secrecy of such an extrajudicial act would neatly explain why no one ever came forward to claim the substantial reward. Today, more than 150 years later, the search for answers continues, and who the Benders were and what happened to them remains a historical, unsolved mystery.